The takeaway is one of the easiest parts of the golf swing to get correct. You're starting from a static position and there's very little movement. However, it's probably the thing that I see in the golf swing that's messed up the most by most golfers. And so when you're learning the takeaway, it's imperative to take the time to learn to do it right, to understand the checkpoints, what you're looking for and why, and how all the things that you do wrong can mess up the rest of the things going on in your swing. So it's super, super important that you take the time to do the takeaway right. So I'm going to go through all the checkpoints and then give you basically a program at the end that you can follow along with so that you can start to feel and check yourself with mirrors and video to make sure you're doing these things correctly. The first thing I want to talk about are a couple of the most common tendencies that I see. And probably 80 to 90% of the golfers that I give lessons to, whether it's at a clinic or in an in-person lesson, do one of these two typical faults that I'm going to talk about. The first one I want to talk about is the wrist hinge. Okay? If I'm standing here at address and all I do is hinge the right wrist. So when you talk about wrist movement, if you've seen the Rotary Swing Tour instructor manual, you understand moving in this plane is cocking and uncocking. This way is hinging and unhinging to keep things simple. So what you want to feel that during the takeaway is that there's maybe a small amount of cocking, which is okay, but there's no hinge. Okay, and I'm going to explain why. First of all, when you put the right hand on the golf club, it's really easy to move the club a long ways just with hinging. This is a dominant move. This wants to happen during the swing. That's the direction you want to move the club. And the quickest, easiest way to move that club in that direction is to hinge your wrist. And so that's what a lot of golfers do. So to start the takeaway, the first thing they do is hinge that right wrist. And so what that does, if you look from down the line, is it shuts the club face. Okay? So now we've immediately started our golf swing requiring some sort of compensation. Whether you're going to have a shut club face at the top and you're going to hold on the way down or what have you, you have to do something to compensate for a closed club face, period. There's no way around it. So we obviously don't want to be building compensations in during the first 6 inches of the golf swing. So what you have to learn to do is keep that wrist in neutral. And so there's a couple checkpoints for you to look at. First, when you move from the right wrist and hinge it, your right hand will tend to end up kind of on top of the club and your left hand will be a little under. So what I mean by that is if you do this, you can kind of get the idea that my right hand is slightly on top of the left versus this would be the left on top of the right, this would be neutral, that's the right on top. So now my club face is shut, my hands are underneath. If you look closely, you'll actually notice that my left wrist is bowed. This action of hinging the right wrist, the left wrist has to do the opposite. It has to bow, and so that's where you end up with this really shut club face. And for most golfers, they tend to do this and get the club way inside. Now my body, if you watch from face on, barely moving at all. But simply by hinging my right wrist, look how far I can move the golf club and never have to engage any powerful muscles. So if you wonder, you don't have any power in your golf swing, and this is you, well, you're not using any big muscles. You're literally just using the muscles in your forearms. Well, how big are these? We need about 32 pounds of muscle to generate 100 miles an hour of club head speed. Unless you have really big forearms like Popeye, you don't have 32 pounds of muscle. So you're not going to be able to generate a lot of speed. Okay? Not to mention that it changes your path and plane and club face angle. So we don't want this. So what do we want? Well, if you'll notice at address, my wrist has got a slight amount of cupping in it, the left wrist. Because of how your arms naturally hang when you bring your hand across and take your grip, there's a slight amount of cupping in here. You want to keep that. It's that simple. You don't want to flatten it out, which will happen if you hinge from the right wrist or even try and roll your left wrist in. You want to keep that perfectly neutral. So let's look at that. If I'll do that from face on first, when I teach, a lot of times I've actually put my thumb on the wrist joint to keep it hinged, and then I'll make them take the club back and hold that angle. So now my wrist is still angled. I still have the same amount of cupping that I had at address. Now let's see what that does to the club face. Well, it's square. All I'm doing is taking it back, keeping the same amount of cupping that my left wrist had at address. Now my right wrist is flat. Well, guess what? When it's at address, it's flat. I'm not increasing this angle. Again, if I hinge my wrist 20 degrees, I can move the club a couple feet. So this is really easy. So if you're kind of lazy in your swing and you don't rotate, which we're going to talk about shortly, you're just going to do this, and you're going to have a really armsy, wristy golf swing and no power or control from your body. So, first thing you want to check is to see whether or not the first move that you have is something like this. Your hands should look like they don't move during the takeaway other than if your body's moving. So right now my hands are staying exactly how they were at address. I'm purely rotating. Hopefully you can see that. So my hands are maintaining the exact same relationship that I had at address with my chest. Not moving my arms or hands, I'm turning my torso. No movement from here, okay? That's the first problem I see. Second problem I see is maybe somebody who keeps their wrists intact but shoves their left arm across their chest. That's the left arm push. So what that looks like, again, is no rotation. See, I'm not turning my body at all, but look how far the club's moving. I can move the club all the way to the completion of the takeaway simply by moving from this left shoulder socket and pushing the left arm across my body. So when I do that, the club's all the way back, but I literally have not made any rotation whatsoever. So again, this leads to a flat inside golf swing. I'm not turning. This is detrimental for a number of different reasons. Obviously, I'm going to tend to swing really flat. I'm going to tend to swing the club too far inside. Also, I'm going to tend to kind of roll my arms and make it even more inside, so on and so forth. So, long story short, you just don't want to do anything with that left side. You're going to learn as we work on this, you're just going to rotate. And I'm going to give you a couple drills as we start to do this to feel how to learn that rotation. So, we know what we don't want to do, and we know what most golfers do. What do we want to do? Well, I use an acronym for the backswing. It's REF, R-E-F. Rotation, elevation, flexion. It's all you really need. And there's obviously little details in there, but that's your big mantra that you want to think about. You're going to make a big rotation, a big body turn. You're going to elevate your arms slightly, and you're going to have flexion at the right arm. Those are all the three keys to having a great backswing and be really simple. So the first part we need to understand, hopefully you've been following the 5-minute series and you've added rotation to your golf swing. Now most golfers I see do this really well when they're doing the drills. If they followed along that video series, they turn really well. But as soon as they put the golf club in there, this is what happens. They get rid of that rotation and now they think they need to swing the golf club. Obviously we don't want to do that. So let's take the club out of the equation to start. Okay? We're going to learn to rotate, elevate, and flexion we're not going to really talk about because flexion doesn't happen until the takeaway is done. So there's actually going to be no flexion during this phase of the learning program. What you're going to learn to do is rotate, and we're going to talk about the key checkpoints for that from face on first. So, rotation. All I'm doing is taking my chest, turning like I'm going to talk to somebody to the right. Yes, I'm using the shoulder blade glide, but you don't need to make it some super complex thing. All you're trying to do is take your rib cage and turn. That's rotation. That's all it is. And you need to do this without facilitating it with a hip turn. This is what a lot of golfers do. I say, okay, turn your back to the target, glide your shoulder blade, whatever I'm using to describe to them, and they do this with their hips. So now, yes, I have rotated. However, I have no coil, and my hips have moved a long ways. Now they're going to have to move a really long ways in the downswing. We don't want to add any of that extra movement. So all we're going to do is rotate. And most golfers should be able to get at least 45 degrees of shoulder turn without moving their hips really at all. I can get a little bit more. I'm a little bit more flexible. That's all we're looking for. We need a tremendous amount of turn during the takeaway, far more than you think you need. Okay? The reason for that is I showed how little the arms have to move the club a long ways, but you need to feel the exact opposite. So a lot of times I'll tell people, write this on the bill of their cap, or in the clinics I teach, I want you to kind of remember a mantra, big body turn, little arm swing. And you can't overdo that for most golfers. I've never seen anybody overdo it, okay? Especially when they put the club in their hand. So all you're thinking about, just leave your arms at address. Forget that you have arms. Just kind of leave them there and turn as much as you can. Well, now I didn't move my arms at all, but guess what? My arms moved. And if you look down the line, if I rotate,